The New York Times has defended the racist trolling of their newest tech editor, Sarah Jeong. According to their statement, she was trolling. This is the official statement of the New York Times, and she posted many racist tweets, so I think it is fair to say she is a racist troll. Whether or not she'll do it again, that's an entirely different story. Now, the left is saying it's not racist because that would require institutional power and you can't be racist against white people. They're also saying that anybody angry about this is alt-right or pretending to be angry. Many people who are conservative or right-wing are saying these are simply anti-white racist statements. However, there are many mainstream sources that refer to her posts as racist tweets, so I think it is fair to say she is a racist troll. In their efforts to protect themselves and to defend their political ideology, the New York Times is actually fueling white supremacy and the alt-right, and this isn't my opinion. Several posts and statements from white supremacists and racists have emerged where they're actually praising the New York Times for doing this because they call it red-pilling normies. Outside of this, we're also seeing deceptive behavior from mainstream sources where they do what's called stealth editing. So let's take a look at the deceptive practices of the mainstream media, and let's take a look at just how, in their attempt at defending themselves, the New York Times is actually fueling white supremacists and racists. But before we get started, take a look down just below the video and you will see a join button. By clicking that, you can sign up for just a few dollars a month to help support my work. This is what I do for a living. I'm actually planning a trip right now. It's very expensive. And if you want to see more on-the-ground reporting and more videos like this, please consider becoming a channel member for just a few dollars every month. First, let's do a quick recap of what happened yesterday. This story from the New York Daily News. New York Times defends newest hire Sarah Jeong amid controversy over racist tweets. And we can see that the New York Times will just call them racist tweets, so I think that's the language we'll go with. The New York Times defended its hiring of Sarah Jeong, whose controversial Twitter posts have come to light in the wake of an announcement that she will be joining the Times editorial board. Jeong in September will join the Times as the lead technology writer for its editorial board from The Verge, where she's a senior writer. But she comes under fire for a trove of old tweets that reveal a deep-seated animosity towards white people, men in particular. "Oh man, it's kind of sick how much joy I get out of being cruel to old white men," one of her old tweets reads. "White people have stopped breeding. You will all go extinct soon. This was my plan all along," one of her old tweets read. Although it doesn't condone the tweets, the Times defended Jeong, arguing that she was targeted because of her work and her race. Her journalism and the fact that she is a young Asian woman have made her a subject of frequent online harassment. For a period of time, she responded to that harassment by imitating the rhetoric of her harassers. She sees now that this approach only serves to feed the vitriol that we too often see on social media. She regrets it, and the Times does not condone it. Personally, I think the New York Times is lying in this instance. I think this is a PR move. And the reason for it is you can actually look at the history of Sarah Jeong's tweets and see that she has made several far-left tribalistic statements outside of criticizing white people. Her statements fall in line with common rhetoric among other people who constantly antagonize or insult white people. In which case, I believe these are her genuine opinions. Additionally, just because she's being harassed doesn't mean she has a right to antagonize and harass others. And they call this counter-trolling. But trolling is trolling. If someone insults you, so you decide to insult everybody, you are just another troll. Well, the New York Times has defended this. And the issue at hand is that white supremacists, the far-right racists, they are loving it because it's what they call red-pilling normies. The fact that the New York Times, which is called the paper of record, one of the most established and powerful and influential news organizations, would defend this kind of anti-white rhetoric shows that, at least in their minds, there is some kind of agenda against white people or that the establishment is against white people. Investigative journalist Jay Casano tweeted this thread. He said, "A missing piece of the analysis of faux outrage around Sarah Jeong being hired by the Times is that the goal of the outrage is not to get her fired. It's to use it as a wedge to polarize people into distrusting the media more. 4chan poll calls this process red-pilling normies." Now, I personally disagree with his initial assessment. I don't believe it's all faux outrage. I believe there are people who are genuinely annoyed and upset by what the New York Times is doing. But also, they're not trying to start a campaign to get people to believe anything. They're just praising the New York Times for getting people to be red-pilled. In one post, he highlights, "It's called waking up the normies. And it's why you're all essing your pants and why shills such as yourself are being fired in our general direction, Gatling-like." Someone responded, "We don't her fired. We want them to defend her and fan the flames of red-pilling. We need to use this to red-pill blue pills about the Jew-dominated anti-white agenda of the media. If we can just make the majority of normies aware of the JQ, the battle is won, the truth will do the rest." The New York Times admitted in their statement they knew about the tweets beforehand. And it's not just the anti-white racism mess, but bias stuff like, I open my mouth to politely greet a Republican, but nothing but an unending cascade of vomit flows from my mouth. Trump is Hitler, etc. And there are some things in that statement I'm not going to read because they'll probably get me booted off YouTube, but suffice it to say, there are people who are very anti-Semitic, white supremacists, racist, or otherwise, who are happy that the New York Times is doing this because, as I mentioned, they are showing that a very powerful establishment has no problem with someone saying that white people are groveling goblins, that they're BS, or that they are going to all die soon. Cassano continues by saying, posts on poll saying things like Sarah Jeong is the best thing to happen in years, and she is the answer, because in their view, it highlights media hypocrisy around racism towards white people. In that light, the New York Times statement wasn't just milquetoast. It also played into their hands by framing Jeong's tweets as misguided, but not grave enough to merit firing. They see that as the Times endorsing Jeong's racism. The Verge is where Sarah Jeong currently works until September when she joins the Times, and they issued a defense of her. In the article, they say, this abusive backlash is dishonest and outrageous. The trolls engaged in this campaign are using the same tactics that exploded during Gamergate, and they have been employed in recent years by even broader audiences amid a rise in hostility towards journalists. They say, we're not going to fall for these disingenuous tactics, and it's time other newsrooms learn to spot these hateful campaigns for what they are, attempts to discredit and undo the vital work of journalists who report on the most toxic communities on the internet. To me, it's interesting how many left-wing outlets like the Huffington Post, Splinter News, and The Verge have defended Sarah Jeong. Because even Reddit, which is notoriously anti-Donald Trump and very far left, is not having any of the BS. When you look at the news thread for the New York Times standing by its new tech writer Sarah Jeong after racist tweets surface, we can see that the post has been locked because it's so controversial. But the top comments are from individuals who are not okay with the statements made by Jeong. One person said, "What the hell kind of country is this if I can only hate a man if he's white?" Quoting Hank Hill, 1997. I don't know if that's a real quote from the show, but the sentiment is obvious. One comment said, "She wasn't a hormonal 15-year-old girl when she said this stuff. She was a Harvard grad. No one with that level of maturity and intelligence can excuse their racist language. It doesn't matter who said it first. If your reaction is to take the cheap, vile shot, you're a cheap, vile person." Suffice it to say, the comments go on like this. Now look, as I mentioned, Reddit is known for being very far left. Many of the top posts are anti-Donald Trump and progressive. And I don't think it's hypocritical of these people on the comments thread to call out the New York Times for defending the racist tweets of this woman. It is very consistent with the opinions of Reddit in that they don't like racism wherever it comes from. One of the most upvoted posts with 2 times gold. This means people liked this comment so much they paid money to put a little star next to it. It has nearly 3,000 visible points, meaning many people have upvoted this post. In it, he says, "This is probably going to be one of the best pieces of recruitment material the alt-right could have gotten their hands on prior to the midterms. Nothing bolsters fear and resentment like the normalization and open acceptance of mainstream hatred towards you based only on the color of your skin. And it really drives the point home when you follow that up with condemnation towards anyone the action upsets. You are bothered by her toxic vitriol and open hatred towards a group of people based only upon their race, you must be racist." Is a pretty S stance to take. Republican campaigns should be sending the New York Times thank you cards. I think it's entirely visible why the alt-right, white supremacists, white nationalists, anti-Semites would love what the New York Times is doing. The New York Times fired Quinn Norton because she had offensive posts in her Twitter history. Sarah Jeong has extremely offensive posts and more of them, and they defended that. It could be that the New York Times is simply refusing to bend to the outrage mob and the tactic is dying off, or it could be political bias and the New York Times doesn't care that Sarah Jeong is racist. But in this comment, he makes a link to the BBC, who openly called this post racist. And now I want to highlight another big problem with the media and how they try to defend themselves. Because the BBC did what's called stealth editing. This is where the article is changed, words are changed, the narrative is changed, and they don't tell the audience, and this can create huge problems. In the comment, he says, "The BBC article on this has more fun quotes from her. Looks like even Britain is appalled by her." And the first thing I want to show is the archive. This is what the post originally looked like. Sarah Jeong, New York Times stands by racist tweets reporter. The first line, "The New York Times has defended a new member of its editorial board who wrote racist tweets about white people." However, after a stealth edit, meaning the article was changed without notice, they put racist tweets in quotes to imply it's not their official position or that they aren't necessarily racist. And the reason I think that's the case is that they actually removed the word racist, changing it to, the New York Times has defended a new member of its editorial board who wrote inflammatory tweets about white people. And this is an extremely unethical practice used by almost every mainstream news organization. They will actually change the context of the article without telling people. And the reason this is a problem, well, I'll give you an example straight from me. I had originally tweeted, the New York Times has defended a new member of its editorial board who wrote racist tweets about white people. This was a direct quote from the article. And you can even see in the tweet, New York Times stands by racist tweets reporter. The original title is still visible in the tweet. However, when they changed the article to inflammatory, it now appears as though I editorialized the statement by adding racist on my own. If somebody sees this tweet and sees the word racist, clicks the article and see that it actually shows the word inflammatory, they're going to assume, because there's no correction or update on the article, I personally added the word racist and that is my personal opinion, when in reality, this is a direct quote from the BBC. Donald Trump has called the press the enemy of the people, and this has been an ongoing controversy, especially in the past week, as Jim Acosta of CNN has led the charge against people being mad at him and calling the press the enemy of the people. But when the New York Times defends racism so long as it's targeted towards an individual race, when the New York Times puts out numerous articles that really do antagonize white people, and when mainstream news organizations like the BBC stealth edit their articles, the New York Times does this too. It makes people believe that they don't have the public's best interest at heart, and it allows for this kind of rhetoric. When the New York Times defends these statements, what do you think Trump's base is going to do? 62% of the United States are white. Not all of them are upset by this, but I assure you, most, if not all, of Donald Trump's supporters are going to be extremely angry with the New York Times about this. The outrage isn't fake. The left might want to claim that it's faux outrage and that it's disingenuous, but I assure you, Donald Trump supporters who stand around the press pen flicking off Jim Acosta are going to be legitimately angry about what the New York Times has done. And when you take into consideration other stories from the New York Times like this one, New Hampshire is 94% white. How do you diversify a whole state? You have to realize that the New York Times articles and their behaviors are perfect fuel and fodder for white supremacists, racists, and the alt-right. What's interesting is that anti-identitarians, people who don't like identity politics, are upset about the double standard being set by the New York Times. But as I've shown you, actual racists and white supremacists and white nationalists love what the New York Times is doing. Identitarians on either side are happy about this. Left-wing identitarians, people like Sarah Jeong, are happy the New York Times is defending her after making these racist statements. And white identitarians are happy because it helps them red pill normies into becoming racially conscious. It just serves to divide us based on race, and it shouldn't be acceptable. So I want to end with this. I want to make sure I highlight the nefarious, unethical practices at large media institutions. They all stealth edit. And I can't stress how unethical this behavior is. Because as you've seen, they have now caused me personal harm. I did not editorialize that tweet. What am I supposed to do now? Delete it because the BBC changed their article without telling people? The only real solution is to use archives. If you want to share an article, make sure you archive it first so it can't be changed, and then share it. And this is a huge problem for news organizations who are already in dire straits. It takes away viewership from them. In fact, many people who are anti-media or don't like the mainstream media archive their articles on purpose to make sure they don't get the advertising views and the traffic. But that's not a good reason, in my opinion, to do it, because news organizations aren't all bad, but they do some bad things. If they're going to stealth-edit articles, change them after you've already shared them, then perhaps the only solution is to archive them to make sure the context of your statements are preserved. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Do you think what the New York Times is doing is intentional, that they're politically biased, or is it possible they're just trying to appease their paying subscribers? Comment below, we'll keep the conversation going. You can follow me on Twitter at Timcast. Stay tuned, new videos every day at 4 p.m. and new videos on my second channel, youtube.com/TimcastNews, starting at 6 p.m. Thank you all so much for watching, stick around, and I will see you next time.